Oh, okay.
Sean Maloney.
George Schell. Hi. So I use a microphone right there. Yours.
Greetings, excuse me, greetings everybody. Every year we have our awards week or weekend or ceremony or event or something where we honor those in the literary field that are judged by the foundation staff. And then this year's a little different because we have, really for the second year, we have nominees, at least in the book category, that are from everywhere. That's why we changed the name of the prize. It's now a prize, the book prize for the foundation. And I think you'll see that when you get a chance to listen to, and then hope you'll get a chance to read the material that these folks have created. We like to give them a chance to tell you about their prize-winning work, but more importantly is how they did it, what the hard part was, and maybe what the easy part was. And unfortunately, Aaron Bateman couldn't make it here for this one, but he'll be here tomorrow night, so you can bump into him and talk to him about it if you're going to be there. We're going to start off with John Schell, who's going to talk about the SA-2. One of my favorite stories about in Cuban Missile Crisis period is one of, the attempts to shoot down airplanes with SA-2s is a saga. And it's not a good one for the Soviets. It's such an amazing story. But he'll talk about the rest of the story. Dave Stumpf, he's amazing. And I'll tell you why. For everybody who is out there who's ever done any research before, the kind of stuff that Dave does is the technical nuts and bolts of some of the systems that are sitting out on the floor in the space hangar out here. And from, the carts that move these things around to missile silos, all the stuff that if you talk to somebody out in the world and said, yeah, that's what I'm going to write about, all the nuts, you'd shake your head and go, nah. But when you look through the work that he's done for the journal, and now it's 4, we got one of his in the journal right here, 4 in a row on this kind of technical research, which just is not done anymore. It's amazing. And so glad to have him with us as well today. Sean Maloney, he's going to be the fun guy here at the event and in the banquet tomorrow. Glad to have him talking about the emergency war plan and others, things that he's working on. Amazing stuff. And Patsy Klein is here also with a series of items that he's worked on, but for 2 in particular, understanding space strategy and then the fight for the final frontier. Timely, very prescient work across the board. So we'll start with John Schell, and tell us about your articles.
Okay, well, I'm neither a writer or a speaker, so I'm talking about what I wrote, I guess. But when I grow up, I like to be like Dave. I'm an engineer by training, and in COVID hit in 2020, I got a note from Chris Pocock, who's a noted U2 historian, about the shootout had been one of the participants dug out information that disputed what the official record was. And I found that to be very interesting, and as a radar engineer, even more so because it involved calculations with radar. So my first look at this thing was to take what had been written and try to see if it made sense. Draw circles where the intercept points were for the SA-2, the max range. Draw what I thought was to be the route of the U-2 based upon what the Soviet had uncovered, and he had been a participant. and put together a potential shoot-down area, which led to me to the conclusion that what had been said about where this was shot down was wrong. It was the Soviets claimed it was shot down by another site, and now we have a whole new site for the first time. Well, that's strange. Why would we know? Why would that happen? Well, that goes back, my story goes back to when Khrushchev was told about the shoot down. He was told about this other site, and they stuck with that story. And they discounted this new site, the 5th Battalion. So I put this together, and the map there on the slide is the first map that I created with, had Chris review it, and he put it on his website. And I did further research. Never intended to write a paper. I'm just researching what's going on here. And so my research led me then to read Gary Powers' book, where he flew and where he turned, to also research what the Soviets said during their investigation of the shoot-down. The second slide shows the map on the left that the Soviets used. They wrote after the investigation, they showed the U-2 flying up towards the 2nd Battalion over to the right, and they saw an interceptor, an Su-9, flying up towards the 5th Battalion. Well, they both can't be true. Only one can be true. We know that the U-2 was hit from behind. So if he's coming in head on, he can't be hit from behind unless he turns and does 180. You can't do that in a U-2. You can't do it quickly. So that didn't make sense. I further researched and looked at one of the participants was named Schell. He was a radar engineer at the 5th Battalion, and his son didn't speak any English, but I got his email from Chris, and so I wrote to him using Google Translate, wrote to him in Russian, and he responded and provided me, on the right you see a radar tracing. A radar tracing is what they use. They had a radar scope in the command band, and the operator would point every minute. He'd put a dot where the airplane had been tracked, and so you see the airplane being tracked up between the 5th and the 6th Battalion, and then it ends around the end of the circle of the 5th Battalion at the edge of the kill zone. So that is a tracing that was buried, or hidden, I should say, classified after the shoot-down. They didn't want Khrushchev to know they had told the wrong story. So the first paper I wrote was about secrets revealed. The second story, which got the award, I wrote the story. The rest of the story, it talks about the whole involvement of airplanes. The Soviet Air Forces and surface air missile forces were commanded by the same head. So that air marshal commanded both, and he had one general commanding the surface air missiles, one general commanding the interceptor forces. And they were in competition with each other, which made it very interesting. So you had a whole bunch of airplanes, Su-9s and MiG-15s flying around the sky looking for Gary Powers, where the first missile that went up from the 5th Battalion, by my reckoning, shot down Gary Powers. So Powers had been shot down, he was on the ground, and they still had airplanes up there hunting for him, because the air defense, the missile guys didn't tell the interceptor guys he'd been shot down. So they're up there looking around. And what happened? They shot one of their own airplanes down. They shot down a MiG-15. Wow, that's a real story now. You've got 8 missiles fired. One missile struck a MiG-15, killing his pilot. One missile struck a U-2, and his pilot survived. So you set up a real situation here now where you've got an air war in the skies between missiles and airplanes. And I thought that's a very interesting thing to write about as a paper. And I wrote that up, and that's what the award was for the rest of the story. Now, it follows that I don't give up on my research. I'm still trying to figure out where did he actually land, because there are different stories about that. And in this month's edition is called the SA2 and U2 a postscript. I actually have located the actual landing spot of Gary Powers. And I went to a Soviet journalist who lived in the area, again writing to him in Google Translate, and he confirmed that I had the right spot. And it correlates with what Gary Powers saw as he came down in a parachute. So we have now calculated the complete fall of the U-2 and Gary Powers in a parachute and his exact landing point. And that's in this journal that just came out that you got a copy of. So again, I'm not a writer. I love to do research. This is fascinating work to me. The article came along as a second thought. I've given talks on it. I've had good reviews, good results, lots of interesting questions. And I thank you for the award.
I just love that stuff. I know we all do. Well, come on, who figured this out? Well, he did. That's great. Next, David Stump, Mr. Technical, amazing, just amazing. When you get a chance to go back through the journals for the last 2 years and look through his notes, look through the notes, then you'll be impressed. And all you have to do is push this little button right.
Actually, if you'll do it, because my tremor will, can you? Well, I'll try.
You'll be good. You'll be fine. I'll leave this chair for you.
Dick suggested I talk about how I actually decided to become a historian. So my talk is, how does a plant biochemist who does research on salt-tolerant plants become a military historian? Well, it all started, whoops, that's what I was afraid of. It all started as a 15-year-old. I made this model. I thought this was a really interesting looking airplane. I didn't realize until I made it that it was a guided missile. And it was on my shelf for a long time, and it was cool.
Here.
And then
Switch places with me.
Then 20 years later, I'm reading a book by, go ahead. I'm reading a book by Norm Friedman, and he mentions Regulus 2 and then Regulus 1. Well, obviously, if there's a Regulus Roman numeral 2, there must have been a Regulus Roman numeral 1, but they didn't make models of that. So he talked about how Regulus 2 and Regulus 1 were kind of a dumb idea because Polaris was so successful. But this is an example to me of history that's written from here and now versus there and then. And I write my histories from there and then. And as we'll see, Regulus 1 was 6 years before Polaris. So I'm interested now in trying to find out more about Regulus 1. So next slide. So I go to what Google was in 1988, which was the card catalog. Now, for those of you who remember card catalogs, and this is true with Google, you have to really think of the key word, because Google will give you a bunch of crap if you don't have the right word. And the other thing about Google is you need to go and look several pages in. If you look at just the first page, often you won't find what you want. So I did that. Go ahead, next slide. And I decided I'd put Polaris in context. It began in 1956. Go ahead. 41 submarines carried 16 Polaris missiles, submerged launch, well documented. So then I decided to look for Regulus 1, and go ahead. It began in 1950, before any idea of Polaris was available. We had the surface to launch. There were only 5 submarines and nothing in the literature, so yay, I have something to write about. My wife wasn't quite as excited as I was. This is what Regulus 1 flight test vehicle looked like. It had a tricycle landing gear. It was recoverable, and the fleet training missiles also were recoverable, saving a considerable amount of money. Okay. Now, it was basically a drone, radar, pulsed radar command or radio command. And those are 2 shooting stars that were involved in landing. This is a landing at Edwards. And you know it's FTV-1 because it doesn't have any landing gear doors, which you have to really want to know that. Okay. So any good history has a chronology. So 1988, I decided to write the book, got permission from my wife. There's a family connection. Her father's first cousin turned out to be the widow of one of the first CO of one of the submarines. Now, you can't make this stuff up. So she said, David, if you want to write this book, the submariners are not going to be all that interested in talking to you because it's going to look like you're a dilettante. So I had to look that word up. And I decided what I would do is I would learn all I could learn about the missile. So when I talked to the submariners, I was talking from some authority. So I went to Aviation Week in Space Technology, which I've heard is also called Aviation Leak. And I looked up LTV, and sure enough, that's where ChanSWAT had been bought and placed into. I called, and I just happened to talk to a receptionist who had just talked to a Bill Michelli, who was instrumental in the Retirees Club. And so I called Bill out of nowhere and told him I was interested in writing a book about Regulus, and he said, you've got to come out to Grand Prairie. I'll set you up with interviews. So he did, and one of the interviews was with the vice president of LTV, which meant I had access to stuff I never thought I'd get to. So he had provided 2 pallets this deep with TOs from Regulus 1 and Regulus 2. He had extra copies. I asked if I could just take one of his extra copies, and he said no. But I wanted to write him a check for the copying, and he said, I can't process a personal check. So I got tons of stuff for free. Anyway, that was the beginning of 150 interviews. 1992, I heard that the USS Growler, one of the Regulus boats, was now a museum piece in New York, so I went to look, and sure enough, there it was. And then while I was out in this direction, I had called and talked to Frank Winter about if there was much Regulus stuff in NASM. And he said, I think we have two artifacts that you'd be interested in looking at. So I was out in New York, I stopped, and sure enough, there was a transit container, which I'll describe in a minute, and the launcher, which were Regulus artifacts. In 1993, I wrote and published the only plant biochemist paper in the Naval Institute Proceedings. And then in 96, published Regulus, the Forgotten Weapon, Turner Publishing. Next. So this is a transit container, 1955. 1955, the interstate wasn't built yet. It was years in the future. So they had to figure out a way to enable transporting the Regulus 1 on the various highways and bridges. Next slide. So the lower slide is Regulus and its folded wing and rudder. Then they put the cover on, rotate it 45 degrees, and go ahead and place this bar. And now you could go and maneuver underneath the various overpasses. So this is what a transit container looks like in April of 1992. I was very excited to see this, and Frank said it was intact. They hadn't opened it. So we opened one of the front and back inspection hatches, and sure enough, there's this beautiful blue Regulus 1, and it had its engine intact, and the nose, took my breath away. So I said, Frank, if you're going to display this in a new building, it would really be a shame to hang it from the ceiling because, and go ahead, next slide, what you need is a short rail Mark IV launcher. Go ahead. And that is a short rail Mark IV launcher. And he said, how do you know that? And I said, well, I can tell from the structure. And if you come over here and look at that ID plate, it says short rail Mark IV. So this is what it looks like now down on the floor. And it's, so RC stands for radio control. 5 is a W5 nuclear weapon, 80 to 90 kilotons. Star is steam assist, Regulus launch, and 70 is the wing fold. It was sent to Norfolk Naval Air Station on October 17, 1955. Okay, next. This is an iconic photograph of a Regulus launch. It used 2 JATO bottles and really made a mess launching. And the carrier guys were not interested in having it on board. So Chance Vaught and the Naval Air Factory, go next slide, came up with, go ahead one more, came up with something called the Star Cart, so that you could launch it using the catapult. And now the carrier guys are much more interested because it took up much less space in the hangars. Okay, now the whole point was to replace the Loon that they tested as to launch off the submarines. So here's FTV-8 getting ready to be launched off the Tunney. The cylindrical hangar held 2 missiles, and at the very end you see guys sitting there on the aft of the submarine. They're setting up cameras to take pictures of the launch. Next. Now, Norm Friedman said it was a bad idea because you had the surface to launch, and Polaris was much better. And he's right. Polaris was great, but the captains of the submarine said to a man, we had no trouble surfacing the launch because the Soviets weren't patrolling off of Petropavl. This is a picture taken by the Navy P-2V, which is out patrolling to try and track Soviet submarines. So Norm Friedman's concern was Norm Friedman's problem, not the Navy's. Okay. So how important was Regulus 1? Regulus 1 had 60 deployments. The Hancock deployed once. Actually I don't know if I have time. It turns out that George Monthan, whose uncle was the person they named Davis Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson after, lived in Tucson. And so I was going to finally have an interview I didn't need to spend money on. So I drive out there, I park, I go in and start interviewing George, and he had some pristine slides from the Hancock deployment, and his wife comes in and says, Mr. Stump, I just backed into your car. So I'm thinking, great. It turned out her Mercedes had a bumper at exactly the same height as the Nissan Stanza van, so there wasn't any damage. Anyway, so Randolph deployed. Randolph was off the coast of Egypt during the Suez Canal crisis. Heavy cruiser deployments, Los Angeles, Helena, Toledo, Macon, the submarines, the Tunney, 8, Barbaro, 8. These are both World War II submarines. Grayback and Growler were purpose-built, as was Halibut. Halibut was involved in locating that Soviet submarine that they tried to bring to the surface. So 60 deployments, so I consider Regulus to be no longer a forgotten weapon. I came up with the title because if I was looking in a bookstore and I saw a forgotten weapon, I'd buy the book just for the title, which is a problem. So for 5 years before the Polaris boats were got into the Pacific, Tunney and Barbero deployed as a pair, so there's 4 missiles, Grayback, Growler, and Halibut. In 1997, one of the captains I interviewed, Marvin Blair, took a copy of my book to a submarine launch ceremony, and he talked to an admiral and said, "Is there any chance we can get the ability to wear the insignia?" And the admiral took the book and read it and wrote the paperwork up, so now all the Regulus guys could wear that deterrent patrol pin. So that was pretty cool. So my wife said, "Do you want to write another book? You need to get funding." So I'm a tour guide at the Titan Missile Museum, and go ahead. And the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program representative came to get information about Titan II because she wanted to write a book about living around the missiles. Well, who wants to read that? So I said, I gave her the tour and I said, if you let me write half of the book on the missile and the guys deployed with it, that'd be great. She said, well, let's see if I get the grant. She got the grant and she didn't want to finish it. So I said, well, $70,000, I'll be happy to take it over. And the Air Force wanted this thing funded, because they funded it, they wanted it written about. So far too many years later, I published it. Now she said, you need to get an advance if you're going to write another book. So I came into an inheritance, and I decided, and then we agreed, she agreed, that was considered an advance. So I wrote Minuteman, a technical history of the missiles defined American nuclear warfare, and just recently ran out of money from my inheritance, but wrote what's probably my last book, The Last 30 Seconds. That's worth buying just for the cover. The cover is an exquisite picture of a launch out of White Sands. So you need a movie offer before you write another book. And go ahead, nothing yet. So thank you, and thank you for the award.
That was wonderful. Okay, he'll be playing down in D.C. Oh, that's great. All right. Just a quick reminder, I wanted to point out part of our awards program is sponsored by Lockheed Martin this year. And all of these speakers are benefits of that sponsorship by Lockheed Martin. So we'd like to thank them as well for their help this year with that program. Next up, I don't know how you're going to top that one. Sean Maloney, come on up.
Okay, let's do it.
I'm going to go back to my seat, though.
Can you set up the,
All I got to do is hit
Just
here,
hit that.
or any of those will work too.
okay, well, where's the best place to start? It's why. Why did I do this? So after about a decade of handling Afghanistan for the Canadian Army, I came back to academia, and I wanted to get back into Cold War history. And I decided to, let's take a look at Dr. Strangelove as a film and see how, compare it to reality. That book became Deconstructing Dr. Strangelove. So the problem is, I was going to put a chapter in there on nuclear strategy. And the more research I was doing on the Strangelove book, the more I found material I'd never heard of. I was getting stuff declassified I'd never heard of. And I thought, okay, this is not going to fit into a chapter. This is going to be something bigger. Originally, it was going to be the Emergency War Plan and the Single Integrated Operational Plan. And then I realized that there's so much new material, I could just do a book on the EWP. So that's how I got started into this. And sure enough, you have a whole bunch of historical problems with the subject, and I'm going to get into those. But my concern was over obsolete historiography. We've all grown up with the idea that there's massive retaliation in the 50s, then flexible response in the 60s, then, okay, we've all grown up with that. I learned that as a grad student. But the more I drilled into this, I'm like, okay, that's nice, but it's far more interesting than that. and it's far more detailed than that. And given the levels of secrecy at the time, it makes sense. But, so, main issue here is there's declaratory policy and strategy, which are what the government puts out. There's the public discussion of it in the media and in academia and in the think tank community, okay? And the public perception of what the strategy is tends to come out of that. And then the third thing is the actual strategy itself, which is actually, in many cases, radically different from points 1 and 2. And I thought, okay, let's take another look at this. There's a lot more here, and can we do it? Now, one of the other problems we run into, again in history, is the Kennedy era tends to edge out the Eisenhower era when it comes to discussions of nuclear strategy. This is the era of Rand and Hudson Institute. Herman Kahn writes best-selling paperback books dealing with the elimination of life on Earth. I mean, this is really in the public consciousness, right? And again, I think pretty much under McNamara, they want to downplay what's happening in the 50s. So it all sort of gets shunted away. It's massive retaliation. It's big, bad, and dirty. Let's move on with our neat, clean, flexible response. So in many cases, that attitude has been transmitted through academia for the next 20 to 30, 40 years. And I thought, okay, given the stuff I'm finding, it's far more complex. So one of the things that comes out of the book, the early war plans in the 40s actually had code names like broiler, headpiece. I mean, it's beautiful. And eventually the Air Force realizes that's a little too inflammatory and moves to, let's just call it the Emergency War Plan, which becomes essentially a living document, okay? But the early planning here, there's a couple things that fall out of it. One, deterrence is kind of nascent. The bomb exists. It's been tested, it's been used, but it's not being pushed as a deterrent at this point. The concept of war at this time is basically we're going to replay Second World War with nukes against the Soviet Union with similar target sets, et cetera. So those early plans don't fit this concept, again, of massive retaliation, or basically what people, this is the dustbin people wanted to put it in. Yet at the time, it's absolutely crucial to understand this. This is how air power, how nukes and air power coexist in terms of conventional nuclear. Okay? There's going to be nuclear bombing and conventional bombing, and it's part of a multi-year war to defeat the Soviet Union. And that gets overlooked a lot. The later emergency war plans actually are specific deterrent instruments. I'll get into that. Where the nuke threat is latent, but there's a number of other things happening at this time. The fact of thermonuclear weapons, their footage in the newsreels, the public discussion of it puts the concept of deterrence much more into the forefront than it had before, and that results in changes to the strategy, okay? And so we have the ability now, or have developed the ability now, to eliminate a single city with a multi-megaton nuclear weapon. That changes it. So the new or the later emergency war plans are geared towards, yes, we're a deterrent force, but the deterrence is based on the ability to carry out the task. Okay, and that's under LeMay, and that becomes much more and more explicit as the SAC becomes a deterrent instrument. Okay, it's going to carry out its task, but during this part in the Cold War, you're maneuvering bombers with nuclear weapons in the air. This isn't airborne alert, as we'll see later. During the 1956 crises, 72 B-47s fly over Canada, half of them loaded with nuclear weapons, and get within the ability of Soviet drift ice stations to pick up the fact they're in the air. And so it's operations like that. The constant readiness of SAC is absolutely crucial, and because that's in public display through popular culture. Matt, so you're dealing with what we would call information operations today, but it was a lot more sophisticated than people have been given credit for here. And the other thing I want to point out is we don't have a DEFCON system yet. And at the time, how is the force launched? It's what I call the options process. So you have option 1 launch, option 2 launch, all the way up to option 16. And that depends on the number of aircraft that are on alert at a particular time or have been told to be on alert at a particular time. From what I can tell from going through LeMay and Power's material, the purpose behind this is you start off with option 1 during a crisis, and then when orders come down and the situation changes, you add on more options. It allows the other side to see your increasing readiness, particularly in forward-based forces in the UK, Spain, and Morocco. So it allows the other side's intelligence apparatus to see that the force is actually increasing in readiness, and possibly gives them an opportunity to get involved in more negotiations. So this is far more sophisticated than just massive retaliation. Okay, there's a lot of thought that's gone into it. Now, what can we actually learn from this? I got to jump ahead a little bit. I just finished writing a book called The Cool War, which deals with nuclear signaling during our present crisis, during the Russia-Ukrainian war. Okay, and in there I started looking at publicly available material on current nuclear strategy. And one thing I found that was very interesting is there were no DEFCONs in the 50s. DEFCON starts in the 60s. DEFCONs still exist. But the problem with the DEFCON signaling mechanism is it's too exposed to popular culture. So the minute you start going to DEFCON 4, 3, 2, 1, or whatever, that's going to trigger off scrutiny, and it may override a signal you're trying to send. So what's happened now is the option system from the 50s, you sort of see a version of that right now in the predecessor documentation for the lead up for the DEFCONs. Okay, and I've sussed out a couple of these. That's increased number of tankers in the air, specifically reconnaissance aircraft like rivet joint, and there's a number of other very subtle things to show increases of readiness without jumping into the DEFCON. So that's it's interesting to see that there's a bit of a connection there. I've got some revelations that I think you'll find very interesting. In many cases, this one particularly, I found through researching EWP a lot of material labeled SenseInt, and then it gets folded into Talent Keyhole, which are the U2 and then the satellite compartments for security information. So I started probing into SenseInt, sensitive intelligence. And in many cases before the U2, you had a lot more intelligence material than I realized was available. Everybody thinks, okay, you've got this sort of jumbled period, and the U2 comes along in 1956 and everything's solved. And that's generally a perception that's been pushed. However, I started finding actual imagery and important things like the SA-1 Guild missile system around Moscow was being photographed by the mail plane coming in for the embassy, among other things. Oh yeah, this is truly interesting, and unfortunately a lot of the material has been lost, but some of it got folded into the CIA material, which is how I found it. And LeMay and crew know about this, and not everything's past the CIA. That whole story is utterly fascinating, and somebody needs to drill a little further into it. But that's fascinating, particularly. Targeting China. How do you target China? So, interesting problem. LeMay actually had met Mao during the Second World War and had insight into Mao. This gets overlooked by a lot of people. And the emergency war plan doesn't really cover China per se. There's some kind of ancillary plan to it. I don't know what it's called, but I've got enough material on it to reconstruct how it would have worked. But it's not a deterrent plan. It's not designed to signal Mao. It's designed to wipe out specific things, because LeMay knows, how do you fight China with 600 million people? Basically, you got to confine it to the land space and strip away its capability of conducting operations in the air, et cetera. So I found a whole plan dealing with China that I hadn't seen before, or in fact any discussion of. I've reconstructed it in the book. Absolutely crucial thing, and we find out, again, moving away from massive retaliation, it's actually the air power target battle complexes. And basically, and again, I don't want to use 1960s terminology to describe it, because that's not, I don't think that's a good idea. It confuses the thing. But in this case here, the aircraft there are all air bases, basically Ukraine and Belarus. This is where the bulk of long-range Dalnya Aviatsiya, or long-range aviation, was based. Okay? And also nuclear storage sites. And some of the SenseInt sites overflew the nuclear storage sites. And my wife and I were able to actually go on the ground in Ukraine in 2019 and find them and survey them. So basically, this particular part of the EWP is designed to destroy anything where bombers could be based. Because what's going to happen here is the Soviet bombers are going to disperse to what are called bounce aerodromes up in the Arctic, refuel, and then carry on and come at us. That's a whole other book I have to finish writing. But in this case here, they're dropping like 3 weapons, one from each numbered Air Force on each target in the multi-megaton yield just to make sure it's dead. Okay? Some people, so it's not designed as a retaliatory thing, it's designed to destroy any possibility of any bomber in the Soviet Union from reaching North America on the ground, which again, nobody's actually laid it out before, but that was quite fascinating. And to see the bulk of it actually in the Western Soviet Union, given where their basing is, right? So it's not out in Siberia like the missiles are later, it's pretty concentrated.
So would that be first strike then?
Well, we don't, they don't view it as first strike, second strike. They don't think that way.
You need to catch the bombers.
Yep.
not at the airfield.
That's right, yeah. I can get into that in detail. The importance of targeting Moscow comes out in the EWPs. The first Moscow targeting is done from what it looks like on presidential guidance in 1949. And they assigned essentially 11 Fat Man type weapons to the Moscow area. Understand Moscow's huge, okay? It's specifically laid out. There are a large number of targets there. But the importance of targeting Moscow becomes central to it. So these debates you see later on in the 70s about PD-59 and, are they going to go for decapitation or not? Well, it's right from the beginning. The EWP 149 has Moscow getting targeted. And this is a reconstruction I've got of that around 1958. There's a package of 6 B-47s in Britain that have modified weapons. And the objective here is they're going to blast their way through the SA-1 ring and hit between 2 to 3 of those, and those weapons are in the 18 megaton yield range. Any 2 to 3 of those will do the job, the criteria they've established for the destruction of Moscow. And you can see the Kremlin being an aim point, okay? So Moscow targeting right off the bat. There's no hotline, nobody's negotiating. They're going to wipe it off the face of the earth, okay? This isn't the debate club you see later with Khrushchev or anything. This is just, you turn this thing on, it goes, and that's gone. This is particularly fascinating. I discovered undeclared Soviet missile deployments long before Cuba. This is really, really interesting. And it torpedoes the idea that Cuba was set up in response to the Jupiters. So the Soviets deploy the SS-3 Shyster, what they call the R-5M. It carries a nuclear warhead. The first clusters of those are deployed in Mukachevo, forward of the Carpathians, and then down in Crimea, long before a missile is even thought about being put in Turkey or Italy. And then later on, they'll move a number of these into East. Yes?
No, I don't mean to interrupt, but I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Okay. I can't help but look at that document and notice the. I can't help but look at that document and notice the classification top and bottom. I mean, where did you get this stuff?
It's declassified by CIA.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
I knew that would freak people out. That's why I put Chess and Rough in there just for fun. So because what winds up happening is later on the sites are found by reconnaissance, but years later. All right, they actually deploy missiles and weapons north of Berlin, and then there's a couple of other things I've stumbled across, which will be in the Soviet book. But these were not deployed with any publicity at all, and almost no knowledge at our end, either through HUMINT or any of that, or any Sensint or whatever. So these are not deterrent maneuvers. You want to talk about first strike, these are supposed to go first. And they're fiddling around with electromagnetic pulse using that weapon system as well, earlier than we thought. The final thing I really want to point out is the distortion I've seen in the historiography about the role of personalities, okay? And a lot of it focuses on LeMay. There's a lot of animosity directed at power, and I think it's wrong. I think there's a lot more to it. Understanding these people and how they had to come to grips with this new environment, I don't think there's enough sympathy directed at them. And that includes Nathan Twining and Thomas White. Okay, so Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then Chief of Staff, U.S. Air Force, SAC-1 and SAC-2. Okay? Now, the important thing that came out of this is that all four of them have deep connections and insight into the communist world that nobody really has, even Eisenhower. So you go back through them. LeMay meets Mao. He has an understanding of what's going on with the China environment. Power and Twining fly to Moscow as part of a delegation where they actually wind up in a drinking bout with people like Khrushchev, I think. They weren't all named, but that definitely, you look at Power's papers, he's like, we got to deter these guys. And the only way to deter these guys is to go for their throat, take their head off. They only understand force. We need to be in their face. Okay? That comes out of that. And Twining goes back to the 1945 when they're trying to deal with the communists in Greece, and not even before the war's over. So he's developing insight into that as well. And Thomas White is equally fascinating. He's an attaché in the Soviet Union in the 30s. So when I see criticism directed against warmongering American generals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you've got four top people here who understand what the threat is. And that obviously played a role in the deliberations in the creation of the deterrent mechanisms. And so that's something else I'd really like to let people know about. And that's all rolled into the EWP book. So that sums it up. There's a lot more in the book. The purpose was to explain how targeting worked, what the strategy was. The sequel to this is going to be a book on the Soviet equivalent, which I've got 2 more chapters to write. And it will get into how they viewed things, not how we thought they viewed things. And I think it'll be a nice will complement EWP nicely. And at some point, I'll move on and do PSYOP as well. But thank you very much. I hope you found that interesting. Not to mention provocative. Not to mention provocative.
That's great. I love that. Is that you, Sean?
Yeah, that's me. That's a Mark 36 yield whatever. That probably yields like 19 or 18 megatons in real life.
Talking about the guy or the bomb?
I could tell you stories. Actually, the Air Museum of the Rockies, who was involved with that? That's where that was. So thanks very much for having a nice selection of nuclear weapons there.
So as Patsy's walking up, Sean's the first Canadian to receive an AFHF book award. We're going outside of the borders, you know. We're looking for the best of the best, and I think you'll agree we got some of that. Really great stuff. Okay, come on up, Patsy. Some of you had some questions about the dates on the awards. They're a little bit behind because we moved the original November event to now. So typically 23 would be awarded in 24, and 24 and 25, but now they're all here. All 5 of them are here for tomorrow night. So that's the date conundrum for you. Patsy, go ahead.
Okay. So thanks again for having me. I'm a aerospace engineer from Georgia Tech, a former or old naval flyer, and graduated Naval Test Pilot School. Being in this building, I am just grinning ear to ear, so thanks for this venue. It's truly remarkable. I'll be talking a little bit about this book and some other research that I've been doing, but thanks for having me. So the job that pays the bills, and everyone needs one of those if you're not retired. So I support the development of strategy for the Space Force and the Pentagon, which is great. It's good having one foot in there, but the job that brings much joy is instructing space policy and strategy courses at the undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral levels, George Washington University, Georgetown, and then a few different places in the DC area too. So I have to pinch myself. I think I have the best job at space pretty much from sun up to sundown, and then often I dream about it too. So my writing progression, I've been writing in some form on space for the last 20 years. The first article I wrote at the Naval Postgraduate School was called Corbett in Orbit. It was using Julian Corbett's maritime strategy for inspiration for thinking about space power and space strategy. That turned into my first book, which came out in '05. When I was in the Pentagon in 2018, this was before we had a Space Force, and the folks there were losing their minds. There was like this idea that space is somehow different. You know, all the rules of war were broken. You know, somehow we had to move beyond our millennia or centuries of experience for competition and conflict and rewrite the book. So if the first book was Corbett in Orbit, the second book I would paraphrase is Corbett is not enough. You can't take one theorist or strategist and apply it in all times and all places. So this brings in a lot of Karl von Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, Thucydides, even some Mao, J.C. Wiley, and B.H. Littlehart, and others. So just, you know, we understand a lot more than we give ourselves credit to with regards to conflict in the space domain. And Fight for the Final Frontier, I'll talk about, but that uses irregular warfare as a framework for thinking about it. And then I was fortunate that the publisher wanted me to do a second edition to space warfare. This is a tagline I use in my writing and when I teach. Space is not special, it's just wonderfully different. If you pick up On War by Clausewitz, he'll talk about the enduring nature of war, but the changing character. Another way to do it for this group is and for the future strategists out there, if you want a new idea, pick up an old book. Okay, so there's a lot of ideas out there that we've forgotten about. Let's just start off with the classics, start off with what we actually understand and has been well studied. So Fight for the Final Frontier, again, it's a pandemic story. Things were going to change. I picked up a friend of mine's, he's a naval historian at the Naval Academy, Small Boats and Daring Men. And the overall thesis of that was that the early U.S. Navy was an irregular force. Okay, it was small, it did incursions, it did harassing of commerce and trade. So now that you understand that I use maritime strategy in my first book, I said, oh, good grief. So maybe what we're seeing today for the Space Force and what's going on in space is just irregular warfare. And I'll define what I call that here. So, and he lays out his last chapter 8 is laying out the strategy for irregular warfare. But that was my aha moment. That's how I got to Fight for the Final Frontier. I was very fortunate and blessed to study under the late Colin Gray, greatest strategic mind the last 100 years. I'm a little biased. Whenever I consider myself a prolific author or something like that, I'll remember Colin. He wrote over 30 books or monographs in the course of his lifetime and over 200 chapters and the like. So definitely prolific. And whenever I get lost on a topic in a strategic sense, I'll pick up one of his works. It inspires me to this day. So making sense. So irregular warfare. Just look at Ukraine. Okay, so you know, as a precursor to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they launched a direct ascent, hit-to-kill anti-satellite against one of their own satellites, created debris. We don't still understand why they did that. Were they signaling? We have GPS jamming on both sides in Ukraine in the area of responsibility. We have debris creation, and then we have what's going on with China and their SJ-21. We have very close proximity operations for coercion and coercive effect. So a lot of stuff's going on there. So what does all that mean? Are we lost? Is this all new uncharted territory? So bringing things down to real world, I call myself a space strategist. If what you write, as far as strategy goes, has no practical use, then it's useless. So let's put things in context. So here's a prop. Everyone, I'm a big fan of props. This was released last month. The Chief of Space Operations signed it out. For all the air power people out there or whatever your domain of warfare is, you'll be happy to know the Space Force is finding its voice. They're talking about weapons. They're talking about offense and defense, orbital strike, terrestrial strike, and the like. It's refreshing. You may see some Easter eggs in there, a direct quote from Colin Gray and Julian Corbett too. But it's nice to see that they're just saying, hey, let's find our, let's bring us back on the Space Force side to our strategic experience, what we understand as far as the enduring nature of war. So we're happy to see that. If you watched the news yesterday, we have a Golden Dome czar, General Gutlein. So this is going to have a lot of space elements, okay? We're going to do, as far as we understand, it's going to be a layered approach to providing a defensive capability for the United States and perhaps Canada too. Canada wants to sign on too. Where does Guam fall into that? Still TBD and the like. But a lot of relevance for space and what we're trying to achieve in today's world. So I talk about irregular warfare. Irregular warfare, as defined in the book, is apart from major conventional wars against an enemy who takes a similar approach. It doesn't mean it's an irregular occurrence. It happens all the time. Now, my colleagues on the panel may be rolling their eyes because they just realized I defined irregular warfare as the opposite of regular warfare. But we do that in strategic studies all the time. We have symmetric operations and we have asymmetric operations. We have the direct approach and we have the indirect approach. So one term really only has meaning relative to the other. Again, it's an old idea. If you pick up literature from the last 50 years, you'll see all sorts of terminology. Irregular warfare, gunboat diplomacy from James Cable, paramilitary operations, small wars. Gray zone operations is a little bit different but still used. And the short-lived, fortunately, military operations other than war. So those are some of the ideas. Again, irregular warfare has been around for a long time. So let's give some examples. We talked about GPS jamming. Also, ahead of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, we saw cyber attacks against a U.S. commercial company, Viasat, okay, which had a lot of large-scale impact in the European theater. We have the role of commercial. So if you're talking irregular warfare, proxies and proxy war. You know, what is the role of commercial with regards to providing military effects? And then rendezvous and proximity operations also. So given the example here, hey Patsy, what's some examples of regular warfare? So fortunately, a lot of this stuff looks like science fiction, and hopefully it'll stay that way, is that maybe when Golden Dome gets manifested. So direct descent hit-to-kill ASATs against a high-value satellite. We have kinetic kill vehicles, different ways of doing sprayers, microwave energy to take out a satellite, lasers. And this is the one that always gets the press is rods from God. So if you deploy tungsten rods from orbit, they impart enough kinetic energy on scale with a 1 to 2 kiloton warhead. So definitely noteworthy. Sometimes folks will say, okay, Patsy, what are you saying? We need to focus on the irregular warfare and not the high end. No, in the end, there's no neat, tidy boxes. Folks who write like myself or teach, we like to say something is this or that. Sometimes the line is blurred. This is, you can read the quote from Secretary Gates. He was paraphrasing Colin Gray, but you got to plan for the high end and the low end whenever you develop your strategies. So I think I gave you back some of your time, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Anybody have a quick question? I got a surprise for you in a minute. No questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question for Sean, if you don't mind. And that you talked about DEF CON and all that kind of stuff. You're also an expert on the Middle East. Do you see that type of sophisticated signaling, monitoring, et cetera, happening now between India and Pakistan?
No, unfortunately. Well, let me put it this way. It's funny you bring that up because a number of us have been discussing that. I think there's a problem in trying to template the way we think on the way they signal. Their signaling is has its own language, not surprisingly, which goes from the gate guard marching routine on the border to what we're seeing up here in Kashmir, Jammu. I think they're I was looking for that kind of signaling here vis-a-vis the nuclear forces and what we would anticipate some kind of escalatory scenario. I'm not seeing it in the same way. But I haven't been watching it as closely as I can. It was end of term at work, so. But from what I've seen, there is signaling, but it doesn't seem to conform to the sort of stuff I see between the Russia-Ukrainian scenario or up in or up with NORAD or with Norway or the Baltic states. I don't see it the same way.
They understand each other?
That's a really loaded question. Yes, yes, I think they do. I've got a friend of mine who actually served there as a Canadian exchange officer, and he and I were talking about this. In the way he was conveying it to me is a lot of it's performative, and that he doesn't see it spinning out of control in an escalatory dynamic at this point. The last time that actually happened that I'm familiar with was in 2001 with the attack on the Indian Parliament. That actually had ramifications for us in Afghanistan, because that looked like that was going to go the distance. But the dynamic then and the dynamic now don't seem to be the same to me. I hope that answers your question.
Similar question. Putin signaling with his Russian talk, is that for internal consumption, or does that have any impact on it?
You got another 45 minutes?
No.
I just literally just written a book about this. That hasn't come out and will come out till October. But their signaling mechanism is indistinguishable from information operations at this point, and it's extremely sophisticated. It doesn't always work because they really screw up on some things like cultural issues. But yeah, I could talk about that forever. It's not just for internal consumption. There is a feedback loop, and they do publish things in certain domains. They're targeting us analysts and us historians to try and amplify what they're saying. At the same time, it's hitting their population with particular messaging as well. So yeah, it's far more sophisticated than what we would have contended with, say, in the 1970s or 80s. But yeah.
Got to cut this one. It could go all day. Let's take, if you could please, take a quick five. Another one of our award winners is going to be speaking. Lieutenant General Dave Deptula is going to join us and give us a talk on the state of the Air Force. So let's take five. Let us change our dress again, and then we'll get rolling with that. Thank
I have
you,
information
panelists.
on
We'll see you all tomorrow night.
I have information on SIGINT. Cargo Hall, who's an NRO,
I've read his stuff.
yeah. He has a paper that talks about the SIGINT missions.